11 years, that's how long Ritchie Blackmore, Ian Gillan, Roger Glover, Jon Lord, and Ian Paice had been apart. 11 years of solo careers, a rainbow of grudges and never fully cooled. And in April 1984, these five men walked back into a room together. No managers, no lawyers, no handlers, just the five of them, checking to see if there was anything left. What they didn't know yet was the album they were about to make would nearly fall apart 73 times over a single song. That it will contain the only curse word Deep Purple ever put on a studio record, and that its biggest hit would become one of the most quietly filthy songs ever played on mainstream American radio without a single station realizing it. This is the story of Perfect Strangers. The classic Mark II lineup hadn't stood in a room together since 1973. So before anyone talked about record deals or tours, they needed to know if the chemistry was still there. That's why the reassembly in April of 1984 was kept so tight. Just a band testing the water. And almost immediately, the old dynamic came roaring back. Ritchie Blackmore had been obsessing over Renaissance lute music and medieval composition, and that fascination bled straight into the riffs he brought to the table. Heavy, hypnotic, almost ceremonial. When Ian Gillan heard them, he didn't need much imagination for the lyrics. He wrote about estrangement, about looking at a past that didn't quite fit anymore. Five men who used to know each other completely, now sizing each other up like, well, perfect strangers. But rebuilding a band isn't just about nostalgia, it's about ego. The writing sessions were democratic in theory and brutal in practice. Gillan and Glover pushed for an all-for-me songwriting split. Everyone gets equal credit, no arguments. Blackmore wasn't having it. He held firm on individual credit, song by song, and that tension shows up nowhere more clearly than on the title track itself, which the band argued over so relentlessly that it took 73 takes just to lock the arrangement. Blackmore hated conventional recording studios. He always had. So instead of booking time at some sterile facility, the band rented an entire estate called Horizons in Stowe, Vermont, and turned it into a home base. Parked outside was a Mobile, a legendary mobile recording truck loaded with a Fairlight CMI sampler worth about $200,000 and some of the earliest digital multi-track systems in rock. And yet, inside the house, they were still plugging into old-school analog Marshall stacks in the strange collision of cutting-edge 1984 technology and stubborn 1970s instinct, and somehow gave Jon Lord's keyboards a clarity they never had before without sanding off the band's trademark grit. Here's the part that really tells you everything about the band dynamics at this point. Roger Glover was supposed to just play bass. Instead, he ended up producing the entire album. He originally wanted an outside producer to manage five famously combustible personalities, but he was the only member all four of the others actually trusted, so the job fell to him by default. Engineer Nick Blagogna later described the atmosphere in that house as flat-out touchy and said he mostly just stayed out of the way and let Glover do the diplomatic heavy lifting. Once the raw tracks were captured in the Vermont cold, the band packed up and moved to Tennessee to a studio in Hamburg, Germany, to finish the vocal solos in the final mix. The gamble paid off. Perfect Strangers hit number 5 in the UK and became the third Deep Purple studio album to go platinum in the United States. The album needed a statement single, something loud enough to announce that Mark II was officially back. That song was Knocking at Your Back Door. And it opens with Jon Lord doing something almost cinematic, layering a dramatic synth melody over his Hammond, deliberately holding the beat back to build tension before Blackmore's syncopated riff finally detonates. The rhythm section, Glover and Paice, locked into a tight mid-tempo groove recorded live in the basement of the Vermont house, giving Blackmore's bluesy, staccato guitar work room to stretch out, and Glover working the cutting-edge gear in Les Mobiles, heavily compressed Paice's drums to get that massive, booming 80s stadium snare sound, the kind that let a bunch of 50-something rock veterans go toe-to-toe with the hair metal bands dominating radio at the time. But the real story of the song is the lyrics. Written by Gillan and Glover, Knocking at Your Back Door is, in plain terms, well, you know what it is. I'm not going to say it because YouTube is kind of funny about these things. Characters like Sweet Lucy and Sweet Nancy drift through a narrative of late-night trysts, all wrapped up in double entendres, so clever, lines about a common cunning linguist and lock in my pocket that American radio stations played it constantly without ever realizing what it was actually about. Gillan later told a story about a Texas DJ who the image is just some random stock image, not the actual guy, but he called him up after the song blew up and asked, "Is this what I think it's about?" And yes, Gillan confirmed it. The response was disbelief. Every conservative rock station in the country had been spinning it in heavy rotation, completely oblivious. The song even crossed over into sports culture, getting adopted by the Seattle Supersonics as arena entrance music in the 80s. Somewhere in Seattle, an entire arena was chanting along to lyrics about that specific act without knowing it. If Knocking at Your Back Door was The Mischief, Perfect Strangers was the soul of the album. It was a slow, monolithic, almost Eastern-tinged epic, and critics immediately drew comparisons to Led Zeppelin's Kashmir, thanks to that same sweeping, marching momentum driven by Ian Paice's relentless, steady drumming. What's remarkable is that, despite being built entirely around one of Blackmore's heaviest riffs, the song contains no guitar solo at all. Blackmore just lets the riff carry the entire runtime, and he's called it his favorite Deep Purple song ever recorded. That riff again traces back to his obsession with medieval and Renaissance composition, and Jon Lord answers it with something totally different from his usual overdriven Hammond attack. Layered digital synthesizers giving the track a haunting, almost mystical Eastern-style phrasing. Lyrically, Gillan took the literal awkwardness of 5 old bandmates reuniting after 11 years and dressed it up in fantasy imagery, drawing from Michael Moorcock's Elric of Melbourne and lines about echoes of the past and shadows of face work as both fantasy narrative and as a direct confession. These men weren't enemies anymore, but time had made them unfamiliar to each other, and of course, that arrangement cost them 73 takes to nail it down. Tucked away as a bonus track is one of the most quietly revered pieces in the entire Deep Purple catalog, a 10-minute instrumental called Son of Alaric. There's no structure here, no verses, no chorus, just a loose, slow-burning blues jam, famously described by critics as the sound of Blackmore noodling in a velvet cape by candlelight. With no vocals to compete with, the guitar work drifts from bright, youthful melodies into darker, heavier, more melancholic tones, practically a musical biography condensed into 10 minutes. Underneath it all, Jon Lord plays a continuous, hypnotic synth and organ bed while Paice and Glover settle into a jazzy, understated backbeat. And the title itself is a rabbit hole. Alaric is widely believed to reference Alaric, the Visigoth king who sacked Rome in the 5th century, but also echoes Elric, the same Moorcock fantasy character who inspired the title track's lyrics. Classic Blackmore, medieval history, and fantasy fiction tangled together. So why wasn't it on the album? Simple math. Vinyl records in 1984 could only hold so many minutes before audio quality started degrading, and a 10-minute instrumental would have eaten into that budget fast. It got buried on the B-side of Perfect Stranger single instead, and stayed a deep cut rarity for 15 years until the 1999 remaster finally gave it a proper home as a bonus track, which would be on the CD. Here's the thing that broke Deep Purple's tradition entirely. Not Responsible is one of the heavier track by Deep Purple standards, with Paice's drumming pushing a blistering pace and Blackmore laying down a jagged riff that flirts with a new wave of British heavy metal sound dominating the UK at the time. Gillan's vocals is throat shredding, channeling the rawest energy of his early 70s performances. But the headline is one single line, "I got no ticket, but I'm gonna take a fucking ride." That's supposedly the only instance of that word in Deep Purple's entire studio catalog. Or as far as I know, if you know any other songs with an F-bomb by Deep Purple, let us know in the comments. I couldn't find any. But it was buried as a bonus track instead of a single and slid under the radar of both mainstream scrutiny and the rising Parents Music Resource Center campaign that was about to reshape the entire music industry, labeled explicit content. Like Son of Alaric, it got left off the original vinyl for the same reason, space constraints, and it became an incentive for fans to pick up the new CD and cassette formats instead that were just coming out in 1984. Interpret the lyrics how you want, but most read exactly what it sounds like, a middle finger aimed squarely at the managers, lawyers, and industry suits who controlled the band during the first run in the 70s, marked to his back and answering to nobody. Perfect Strangers didn't just sell, it became a genuine cultural event. The supporting tour turned into the second highest grossing tour in America that year, trailing only behind Bruce Springsteen. The European leg peaked on June 22, 1985, when Deep Purple headed Nebworth in front of 80,000 fans standing in ankle-deep mud, with Jon Lord cheekily working a snippet of Singing in the Rain into the set. The bill that day also featured Scorpions, UFO, Meatloaf, and Mountain, and many other bands. But in America, the demand was just as intense. They played places in the Midwest, like Market Square Arena in Indiana, and they played the Summit in Houston, Texas, with the band Gufria. While a lot of 70s peers were struggling to avoid the Nostalgia Act label in the MTV era, Deep Purple's reunion pulled in a whole new generation of teenage fans thanks to the radio dominance of Knocking at Your Back Door. But offstage, the old wounds reopened fast. By the midpoint of the tour, Blackmore and Gillan weren't speaking, separate dressing rooms, separate travel. The band had to physically keep them apart to function, and yet somehow on stage, none of it showed. The encores were still lethal, still built around sprawling jams like Smoking on Water and Space Truckin', with Blackmore still occasionally smashing a Stratocaster to pieces for old time's sake. The tour wrapped in late 1985. The band was exhausted and wealthy, but they were proven right. The world had missed them. But Gillan's voice was taking a beating from relentless schedule, and Blackmore's patience with his frontman's ad-libbing was wearing thinner by the night. The cracks that opened on this tour wouldn't heal. They'd only widen, setting the stage for an album that came next. Next time on the Deep Purple family tree, the reunion starts to buckle under its own weight as the band heads into what I believe is one of their most underrated albums, House of the Blue Light. That will be next. Check out the Deep Purple playlist. Should be on your screen right now. It has the entire story of Deep Purple. The past couple of weeks, I've been covering a lot of Whitesnake, Rainbow, Gillan, Ian Gillan Band, and a few Black Sabbath albums. But now I'm going to be focused mostly on Deep Purple and Whitesnake, as those are the two surviving bands that I'm covering. So that will be coming up. But I also have another Black Sabbath album coming with a Deep Purple alumnus that you might not have known about, or maybe you do, but that's coming up as well. So like, subscribe, see you in the next one.